All right. Well, my name is Michelle Morand, and I'm here with Alexander Rowland, who we affectionately call the cancer guy. We are precision oncology specialists, people who help cancer patients and their doctors find the best possible treatment that medical science has to offer. Everything we provide for folks is FDA or Health Canada approved. And we're really just helping to shorten that time span between the time something becomes evidence-based and proven in support of cancer and better than what's currently on offer to the time it actually gets taken up by mainstream medicine, which can be 5 to 10 years depending on the implement. In fact, we're going to talk about some tools that Canadian oncologists have been wanting the government to implement for almost 20 years now and still are not part of standard care. So our job is to make sure that you know what's possible and how to get it and how to advocate for yourself. So today we're here to talk specifically about melanoma. And I have grilled Alex on the topic and prepared a presentation based on his answers. I'm sure there's tons more that you could add and will add, Alex. There's a PDF that's associated with this. I will post it in the chat so you can follow along if you like, but the PDF will be sent to you as part of your registration and when you get the replay from this webinar. So if you just want to listen and take notes, and again, post your questions in the chat, we will do a question and answer period at the end. But if you want to download that PDF now and follow along, I'll be loading that in the chat shortly. Alex, maybe you want to say a little hello and tell us a little bit about your thoughts about cancer care in 2021, or anything you most want people to get out of this call or this chat today.
Yeah, well, I think you really summed it up nicely there, Michelle. The concept that there's still things from over 20 years ago that we're trying to have implemented in current oncology. I was reading a study the other day, and I thought, wow, did we actually discover that in 2008 and we're still struggling to get it applied? You know, it's really quite amazing. I look at it kind of the way we could look at Canadians and clean drinking water. I mean, we still don't even have clean drinking water to every Canadian household. Mm-hmm. So, precision oncology, you've really got to take the lead. You've really got to find out what's best for you and dig deep. Make sure you use science-based knowledge and find out, what opportunities are there for you. Attending medical conferences is a great idea because you see a lot of the things as there is being established. And, often you can get in on those sort of trials.
Well, and these days, the upside of the pandemic is so many of those conferences are online now, or have really moved forward to allow people to attend from a distance. And there's hundreds of those conferences every year, aren't there, on cancer in general, but then also on specific types of cancer.
Yeah, the major conferences is probably good 300 of them every year. When I say major, I mean, fairly significant ones. There are some really landmark ones that occur every year, like ASCO, American Association of Clinical Oncologists. That's my favorite. Then EMSO, and then there's a Asian version of that too. So there are some great key seminars and symposiums, but there's lots of little ones, and lots of universities have them. So there's many different resources out there.
And one of the things, sorry, please go ahead, Alex.
In fact, the real issue and why we're here today is nobody's really putting these resources together, and nobody's really organizing this. And I think really this is our goal, is to, provide stratified information for people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that you can action on now.
Exactly.
Rather than waiting for your oncologist to hear about it and then for it to be, again, part of standard care.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I have loaded the PDF in the chat. Again, just to reiterate this, the link to the PDF and to the replay of this video will come to your email. So you're welcome to just listen along and make some notes and post your questions in the chat. But the PDF is there if you want to access it now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen so we can still see Alex, but we also get to see this PowerPoint presentation. And let me just do that. All right, so what should be happening is you should be seeing Alex in one screen and the presentation in another. Is that what's happening, Alex?
Yes, I can see the presentation and me.
Okay, fabulous. That's how it should be. All right.
Not that
So
I
tell
want to
us.
see me.
Okay, so we're going to talk a bit about melanoma here. So we're going to talk about what it is, how it forms, how it's treated in standard care right now, some recent innovations, why those innovations matter, why they work so much better, and of course, the most critical element, how you can get access to them. So that's what we're going to do today. And over to you, Alex.
Yes, well, first off, I would really like to thank Michelle for putting together this presentation. She did it entirely by herself based on the conversation we had, which wasn't that long of a conversation. I handed her a big overview, and then also she edited it herself. And I'm a real stickler for accuracy in science. And our editor had accidentally put the DNA spirals in the wrong direction. So unfortunately, poor Michelle had to work very hard this morning to correct them. So thank you for that too, Michelle.
Yes, because otherwise Alex was going to put his foot down and not attend the presentation, because, you know, it's good that he's that fastidious about the science stuff.
Yes.
Yes. All right. So what is melanoma, Alex?
So melanoma is a disease of the melanocyte cells. Basically, those are cells that contain the pigment that gives your skin color when you suntan. And basically, it's just a cancer specifically of these cells. These cells are unique. They're different from other cancer type cells. So melanoma has some unique molecular features and some very unique genetics that allow it to be treated and to allow certain targeted therapies. And we'll get into that in a bit. But basically, it is the cancer of the melanocyte cells. They're somewhat deeper in the skin layer. So that's one of the issues with detection of melanoma, is by the time you see a melanoma, a spot, typically it's burst through the skin and it's come from a deeper area of the skin, and therefore, it needs to be treated right away. So that's one of the unfortunate things about melanoma, is it's a little insidious in that way.
Oh, hang on a second here.
Should I go ding? Oh, ding.
Yes, you'd go ahead.
Ding.
Lie at me.
Okay. So risk factors, there's a lot of risk factors that are well established. Things like having red hair, like myself, fair skin and freckles, people that burn easily. Typically, they have their melanocyte cells all grouped together in little patches, which are called freckles, rather than spread out. And so then there's areas of skin that does not have protection from the sun. And, the freckles do have protection from the sun. So, blonde or green or other light colored eyes, red blonde hair, obviously. Being exposed to natural sunlight or even artificial sunlight, from tanning beds can be a bit risk factor. Being exposed to certain, environmental factors in your home. There's also a bunch of environmental carcinogens that can increase your risk for melanoma, such as radiation, solvents, vinyl chloride, PCBs, and so on. Having sunburns as a teenager or a young child when you're susceptible to this. Having a lot of moles, having a family history of specific types of moles, having other members in your family with melanoma can be a risk factor, and just basically being a Caucasian person is a huge risk factor. There's also certain inherited genes, such as the MCR1, that we see in a lot of redheads that can give you certain increased risks depending on the mutations you have in that gene. They can give you increased risks towards skin cancers and melanoma. And then, of course, having a weakened immune system, which leaves you susceptible to any cancer. Okay, ding.
Thank you. Got a little jumpy there.
All right. So diagnosing melanoma, well, typically you're going to have a physical lump that you see that is bleeding or weeping, pus, or is getting scabby, and you'll go see a doctor. A doctor will typically take a biopsy, obviously, but they'll look at other blood markers. One of them is called LDH, lactate dehydrogenase. This is something that can be elevated in a variety of different cancers, but it's specifically used in melanomas. And it can, a very high level can also indicate a poor response to treatment in melanomas. So basically it's something that is a blood-based test that they will look for if you have a suspicion of melanoma. Ding. And then, of course, the biopsy is probably the most important component. And so typically what happens with the biopsy is they'll do a punch biopsy. They'll look at that specific mole. And then they'll try to cut around it and cut the mole out and have a nice wide excision margin, which is basically where they will cut around the tumor. So or the mole, it's a mole at this point. We don't know if it's a tumor or not yet. They'll cut around the mole and they'll have some clear skin just so they can see if the actual mole, if it is a tumor, if it's invading the surrounding tissue. And then another thing that's common, typically used in breast cancer, is a sentinel lymph node biopsy. So if you have any active sentinel lymph nodes, a sentinel lymph node is basically the lymph node that drains from the tumor. So in other words, it's next in the direction of the tumor or the mole in this particular case. So lymphatic fluid goes through your lymphatic system, and you have these lymph nodes all throughout. They're like little train stations on a subway map. The direction is the same direction. It's one direction. And so the flow is typically from a lump or a tumor to the lymph nodes or to the sentinel lymph nodes, the draining lymph nodes. So ding. So the pathologist will look at the sample, and they'll look at things like the thickness of the tumor as an indicator of how aggressive it is, how many different skin layers it's gone through. And then, of course, if it has gone into the sentinel lymph nodes. So the reason they look at the sentinel lymph nodes is because that can help determine whether the tumor is metastatic. In other words, has it spread beyond the lump, or has it, is it just contained within the lump, or has it actually traveled? And often tumors will travel through the lymphatic system. However, they can also go directly through tissue, and they can also go through blood. So the sentinel lymph node is just one way of trying to determine whether there's a high risk of metastasis. Ding. So then typically a doctor will order a CT or an MRI. And if they see any suspicious lumps, what they will do is they will measure the size of them, and then they'll keep scanning you over periods of, typically 4 months, and see if those lumps have grown. So in other words, they'll try to see, okay, is this just a cyst, or is it, just a benign lump? And the way they'll look at that is they'll determine whether it grows over a set period of time by repeat scanning. Ding. So there is a better technique for detecting cancers in real time. It's called a PET-CT. PET-CT is 2 different imaging modalities, positive electron tomography plus a CT scan. And then basically what it is they will inject this radioactive isotope it's quite a active isotope, but it doesn't last very long. It only lasts I think it only has a half-life of about maybe 20 hours or so, or less. And they'll attach this radioactive isotope to a sugar. And so the concept there is that any cancer cells, since they're constantly growing and constantly dividing and growing, they're highly metabolic. In other words, they're they're using a lot of resources and foods, and therefore they're going to preferentially drink up a lot of the sugar radioactive isotope. And then what they do is they give you a CT scan, and any lump that's drank up a lot of this radioactive sugar isotope is going to glow under a CT scan, and it's going to glow much brighter than the surrounding tissue. And so a cyst is not going to be very metabolically active, so it's not going to grow. It's not going to drink up very much of this PET CT fluid, as we call it, and the amount of the fluid that a specific lump drinks up is referred to the serum uptake value. And it's important because it can indicate how aggressive a tumor is. So, you can have a very small tumor that's very aggressive and might have an SUV of 28 or 30. That means it's drinking up a lot of this fluid because it's really growing. And that one is most likely to metastasize. You could also have a very large lump that has a very low SUV of, 2 or 3. And therefore, that one is not so damaging. With a CT scan or an MRI scan, the doctors are going to focus specifically on the larger lumps because they believe they're they're the highest risk of growth and damage. However, a PET CT will allow you to stratify and tell you which of those lumps really are the ones to focus on and how aggressive they are. And then you can track your response to treatment by seeing if the SUV goes down, which is a very important consideration. It's something you can't do with any other form of imaging. So the important thing with the PET CT is it gives you real-time data. You don't have to wait for months and months and months and act as a petri dish for a cancer to see if your tumors are growing. You get your data right away. You find out, yes, this is a tumor, or no, it's not a tumor. And this is really important. In fact, there's been lots of studies on this. And I would say between 80 and 90% of the time, when a patient gets a diagnosis and then they go out and get a PET CT by themselves, a private PET CT, that will change and modify their treatment typically in about 80 to 90% of the time. So a lot of the time, patients are being told that they're cancer-free, and we'll do a PET CT scan and find out that they missed some tumors. And luckily, if they hadn't done that PET CT, those tumors would have festered and grown and metastasized, and that would have been it. But it allows us to catch those tumors and deal with them in the moment and stop the disease from progressing. Another thing that can happen is radiation therapy or different therapies can be applied to tumors that are not even tumors. In fact, we had one case where a gentleman with lung cancer was on his his sixth treatment of very harsh chemotherapy drugs. He was told that he had a large tumor in his lung and that he didn't have long to live, and that he should probably get his affairs in order, and he should get on with his life and do his bucket list. So he sold his house, he sold his business, he started living a little differently and traveling a lot more and spending his money. And he was going through this chemotherapy, and he when he called us, he said, I feel really good. I don't know why, apart from the chemo, I don't know why they say I have cancer. Of course, we hear that a lot. So when we did get the PET CT scan, we were shocked to find out that he never had cancer in the first place. In fact, the doctors were treating this benign lump in his lungs. So there is another case that does happen, but typically in most cases, the tumors that are being either targeted for biopsy or for treatment like radiation therapy, or being monitored to determine the staging of the disease, are not what they're supposed to be. And so PET CT is accurate to the 95% range, whereas a CT scan or an MRI is only probably accurate in the 40 to 50% range. So you have a nice little statistic here, Michelle. Mm-hmm. That PET CT is not used a lot in Canada. Do you know how many PET CT machines we have in Canada, Michelle?
Not with supreme confidence, but it's less than 40.
Less than 40.
Yeah, okay. It's about that. It might be 32 or something like that, plus 8 or 9 privates. Right.
And I mean, I know Washington State just below us has like 500 or 600 PET CT machines. Just the one state.
Yeah,
So,
yes, as we see here, and this statistic actually doesn't even include the US, because
oh boy,
the US doesn't have like a public medical system or
right,
a
right.
government funded program. But the US, yes, does have thousands of those machines, whereas we have 30 something.
Yeah, 30 something. And so,
Yeah.
so we're actually listed as 23 out of 28 of
For
the,
diagnostics for cancer, that's right. Yeah,
wow.
for a few reasons, but this is one of the main ones. And the PET-CT is actually one of those things I was talking about earlier, where in 2005, the College of Physicians and Surgeons and the Oncology Association of Canada petitioned the federal government to switch from the use of CT scan to PET-CT for cancer diagnostics, and the federal government didn't. And that was 2005. And nothing has been done since then, really. So all that is to say, this is just one piece that we're going to share with you today that you actually have some power over. You can certainly advocate for yourself. We'll talk about that with your oncologist and see, they might be willing to get you a PET-CT. Alternatively, a number of provinces do have private scanning facilities. And, as Alex just mentioned, there's such great value in taking it upon yourself to get one of these scans, and just make sure you know where, yes, it is cancer, where exactly is it, how aggressive are the tumors, what needs to be targeted first. Even from a radiation therapy perspective, it's very beneficial.
Yeah. And, a lot of the doctors that I speak with, they're either anti-PET. In other words, they say, oh, it's not going to give us any information that we can use, which is very, very wrong. And I think they're being told to say that, or they just say, I'd love to get you a PET-CT, but I get turned down six out of 10 times when I try.
Most of the time it's that, but yes, there is this element where because they can't offer it, they're not that well educated on it.
Yes, and they're frustrated by it, so they don't want to talk about it.
Yeah, I know, we can empathize, but that's why we're here, is so that okay, this thing here probably, if you yourself want to have peace of mind that you know exactly where cancer is and isn't, and that you're being treated well, this is an excellent place to start.
Yes. Great. So standard treatment for melanoma. It was pretty barbaric quite a few years ago when we started. We would get these stage 4 melanoma patients, and they would say to us, hey, you can do the chemotherapy, or, the doctors would say to these patients, you can do the chemotherapy, we can do surgery, but it's really not going to do any good. I suggest you just live out your life. So we had quite a few patients that were given that ultimatum. Chemotherapy just doesn't work for melanoma. The drugs they were using were pretty harsh, and we're not getting very good responses. Surgery worked, radiation sort of worked, but the tumors would keep coming back typically. So if you go to the next slide. So the standard treatment today, which was not the same as when we first started, 11 years ago, 12 years ago. In fact, one of our first patients, one of the first few patients we ever had 11 years ago, we had sequenced their tumor with a very basic genetic test at the time, and found that this patient had this targeted BRAF V600 mutation, which we'll talk about now. And there was a clinical trial for this patient, and we were able to get them into the clinical trial. And then the doctor talked them out of it and said, no, don't bother. It's not going to do anything. There's nothing for melanoma. So as it so happened, this treatment went on to be one of the best standard of cares. So today it's a standard of care. It's called BRAF inhibitors. So a lot of people with melanoma have what's called the BRAF V600E mutation. And so BRAF is the name of the gene. The mutation is a valine, and that's what the V stands for. So you normally have a valine at your 600 position, and it gets converted into an E, which stands for another amino acids. So the V and the E refer to, are the first letters, well, they're not the first letters, they're the letter designation for one of the amino acids. And so in this particular case, a V at the 600th position gets converted into an E, and that's a mutation that causes this gene to stay active all of the time, it does what's called constitutive signaling. In other words, when it binds onto its partner to tell that partner to activate, it gets stuck there and it can't release, and it constantly signals the cell to grow and divide. So with the knowledge of these BRAF mutations, along came BRAF inhibitors. The first one was vemurafenib, and now we have dabrafenib and encorafenib. One of the interesting things that happened when they started using BRAF inhibitors is they started realizing that something was happening with them. In other words, they get a great response, and then the responses would start diminishing. And then some of these patients would actually start developing a side effect, such as a squamous cell carcinoma, a different type of skin cancer. And what they found out was that this signaling pathway that the BRAF was involved in, it's referred to as the MAP kinase pathway, that it had a bunch of little side chains. In other words, it was functionally redundant. So it was kind of like that, I like to use the analogy of the fair game, the whack-a-mole, where you sit there with a little, mallet, and these moles pop their heads up, and you hit one, and then another one pops up over here, and you hit that one, and you keep hitting them. And so cancer signaling is a bit like that. And so when they targeted the BRAF pathway, it overactivated the MAP kinase pathway. And so they found that if you combine it with another inhibitor called a MEK inhibitor, so a MEK is also another component of the MAP kinase pathway. And so what they did was they found that if you combine the BRAF inhibitor with the MEK inhibitor, not only do these patients get a much longer response, but it actually reduces the side effects. So I believe, don't quote me on this, but if I recall, it was about 20% of patients who had a BRAF inhibitor by itself would get a squamous cell carcinoma. And then when they added a MEK inhibitor, it went down to like about 2%. So significant difference and a reduction in side effects. And that's very counterintuitive. You'd think adding another drug would not reduce the side effects, but it actually does. So now we have the combinations that we use. There's a dabrafenib plus trametinib, which is a MEK inhibitor, vemurafenib, another BRAF inhibitor, plus cobimetinib, which is a MEK inhibitor, and then encorafenib plus binimetinib. Now, each one of these is basically an offering from a different drug company. In other words, one drug company came out with dabrafenib, another drug came out with vemurafenib, another drug company came out with encorafenib. All three of these drugs, while they do target the BRAF V600 as their main target, they also target other cancer signaling pathways. And so this is something that's really important to understand. When you know what the signaling pathways that are driving your cancer, because it's going to be more than just the BRAF V600E. It may be the main driver, but there's going to be a bunch of passenger mutations that could potentially be drivers at a later point of disease, or that could also cause resistance. You want to know what they are. And therefore, picking dabrafenib over vemurafenib is all about knowing what other signaling pathways you have. So dabrafenib may inhibit certain other genetic pathways that vemurafenib doesn't. And encorafenib may inhibit other pathways that dabrafenib and vemurafenib don't, and vice versa. So each company is making one of these drugs, and they're going to have slightly different profiles. So which drug to use? Well, typically doctors will say, let's try this drug. If that doesn't work, we'll try this drug. If that doesn't work, we'll try this drug. We like to cut to the chase. We like to find out what the molecular markers are of your cancer, and then decide which one of those drugs is best for you. So that's just a bit of a prelude to what we're going to be discussing later on in this seminar. So the take-home message, 2 drugs. 2 drugs to limit 2 pathways. Sorry, ding.
No problem. I jumped the gun again.
Okay, so what if you don't have this BRAF V600 mutation? Well, what I should say, what we found, and we've had some very interesting cases with this. So typically, if you don't have a BRAF mutation, then what will happen is you will get now a new treatment. The standard of care is immune therapy, PD-1 inhibitors and CTLA-4 inhibitors. So I'll talk about them. They're very, very interesting advanced new therapies. So basically what happens in cancer cells is it's probably about 12 or 13, maybe 14 different pathways that cancer cells shut down in our cells, and they shut them down. And what these pathways do is they inactivate the immune system. In other words, there's about 12 to 14 different pathways that cancer cells can manipulate to hijack the immune cells. And the reason they like to hijack immune cells, they want the immune cells to come into the tumor, and then they want to turn them off, because then the immune cells will supply them with growth factors and proteins and all kinds of different things called cytokines, different things that they need to grow. So immune cells and tumor cells have a lot in common. They both use a lot of the same resources, the same growth factors. And so because of this, cancer cells have evolved to adapted to hijack the immune system. Typically the T cells are what they like to hijack the most. And so one of those pathways is called the PD-1 pathway, programmed death 1. So what cancer cells do is they will produce a lot of this PD-1 protein. So the PD-1 protein is something that is on the outside of a cell, and you have to have this PD-1 protein to protect your cells against the immune system. And if you don't have it, then the immune system will typically attack that cell. I'm talking about this in a very simplistic, general way. I'm not going to get into the heavy details of immune therapy, because we'll be spending hours talking about the interactions and the different receptors and so on. So in short, can you go back, please?
Oh, sure. This was just a slide about PD-1.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. So in short, there's a few things and we will talk about PD-1 in this next slide. I just wanted to mention a few things before we get into that, but there's a few different pathways. PD-1 is one of them. CTLA-4 is one of them. And those are two pathways that we now have drugs for. So in other words, what happens is the cancer cells shut down the immune system using those two pathways, and the drugs we have reactivate those two pathways so the immune system can recognize the tumor. And now, this all came about in melanoma. These drugs were first developed in melanoma. And the reason is that melanoma cells, as I mentioned, there's some unique features about melanoma cells or melanocytes. They're slightly different from other cancers that typically happen in skin cells. What it is that there is a lot of what we call heterogeneity between the different cells in a melanoma. And so some of those tumors, or what heterogeneity means, is variation. There's a lot of different genetic variation between the individual cells in a case of melanoma. So one tumor could have, a lot of different genetic features throughout the different cells. So some cells may have certain genetic features that other cells in this exact same tumor don't have. And so because of that, melanomas typically have a lot of what we call identifiable antigens. In other words, they look very different. They have a lot of unique features that, when you look at them on a molecular level, they don't look like each other. They stand out compared to other cells, which is unique for cancer. And this allows the immune system to recognize them more easily. So typically what will happen is when you start developing a melanoma, the immune system recognizes it right away. Whereas with other cancers, it doesn't necessarily recognize it so quickly. But because of this variation between the two different, or between the different individual melanoma tumor cells and tumors themselves, they stand out, and the immune system is much more able to recognize them and target them. It's just that it gets shut off by these different pathways. And so Michelle put a nice note there that we were one of the first to use immunotherapy on a melanoma patient in Canada. That patient was stage 4. They had no treatment options. They had a few months to live. And it was just an amazing response. The person is still alive today and completely cancer-free, almost what, 6-7 years later. So since then, we've been using these drugs a lot. So you can go to the next slide now, Michelle. Thank you. So a little more specifically on PD-1, and I'm just going to move my slide over a bit so we can see this. So PD-1 is called Programmed Death 1. And this is one of the most successful new cancer treatments that we've had. We have these drugs called PD-1 inhibitors. So what cancer cells do is they'll create this bubble of PD-1 around them, so to speak. I'm talking more in a generalistic, simplistic term. So imagine that these tumor cells mass produce this PD-1, and a PD-1 inhibitor goes in there and mops up all of that PD-1. So now the immune system can see that. So think of the PD-1 as a camouflage for the tumor cells. Think of CTLA-4 as another camouflage for the tumor cells. And think of these drugs that inhibit them as sponges that soak up the free PD-1 and the free CTLA-4. That's much more complicated than that, but that's how I like to envision it. So we have two drugs for this now. We have many drugs for PD-1 inhibitors, but we also have a few CTLA-4 inhibitors. And so the combination of these two inhibitors can be very effective in melanoma cells. So you can go to the next slide. So briefly, I just want to mention something about the BRAF and about the immune therapy. So often, yes, immune therapy is used when you don't have a BRAF mutation in standard care. However, what we have found out is that it's actually a lot more complicated than that. Because of this huge heterogeneity between the tumors, many patients will have some tumors that have BRAF mutations and other tumors that don't. So there's a lot of variation in this. And we've had a few cases where we've had to treat patients with both treatments. They've had BRAF therapy up front because they're BRAF positive, and then that stopped working because not all of their tumors were BRAF mutated. And then we had to use immune therapy, or vice versa. We've used immune therapy, and then a couple of tumors have popped up that were BRAF positive. So once again, this really feeds into the importance of precision oncology. And Michelle's done a wonderful job explaining precision oncology here. We're going to start talking about precision oncology and what it is. And just basically what precision oncology is the right drug for the right person at the right time. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So Michelle's came up with this incredible system she calls the 4 pillars of precision oncology. I love this. And basically what we do is we do genetic and molecular testing. We look at the DNA and determine what mutations are in the tumors. In other words, what has caused the normal cells, what genetic alterations, what genes have been altered to convert the normal cells into tumor cells. And so in humans, you need to have 4 genetic mutations, or 4 mutated pathways, should we say, but they can be single genetic mutations in 4 different pathways for a normal cell to transform into a tumor cell. So 4. So it's 3 in mice, because mice have what we call an activated telomerase, and alterations in the telomerase gene are a hallmark of tumors. And the telomerase is basically an enzyme that protects the end caps of our genes, our chromosomes. And they're what we believe to a certain degree results in aging. I probably shouldn't get into telomerase right now, but cancer cells basically live forever. And one of the reasons is that they reactivate telomerase, that enzyme. So that's one of the 4 genetic mutations. So we have 4 pillars and 4 genetic mutations, which works quite nicely together. Michelle? So we look at the DNA. Oh, can you go back, please?
Oh, sure. I have created a slide to talk about each of the pillars, so please don't go
great.
through.
Yeah, I want to go through each one individually. So genetic and molecular testing is DNA testing and looking at mutations in the tumor cells. Personalized research is very important because that occurs in real time. And basically what that is let's say you have a certain mutation. What we would do is we would look at that mutation and say, okay, based on today, what is available information for that specific mutation? Because every day that's going to change. There could be a new drug for your mutation, today that wasn't there yesterday. There could be new information about a different combination of drugs for your mutation that just wasn't available 2 days ago or a week ago. Then there's obviously the targeted treatment plan, where we come up with the combination of drugs that's important for you. And then we also look at what's called treatment monitoring. And that is the process of determining on a molecular basis, is your cancer growing or is it responding to the drugs that you're getting? And is it time to change drugs? When is it time to change drugs? That's very important. And that's something you can't necessarily do with a scan alone. So ding. So the first pillar is basically, as we mentioned, looking at the DNA. So we have, if you're not aware of what DNA is, all of the coding that creates life in general, life as we know it, biological life is created by DNA, or in certain viral forms are created by RNA. Although viruses aren't considered living species, many would dispute that, including myself. DNA is the template for most biological life, and it's broken down into a series of genes. We have roughly about 25,000 different genes. All of the cells in our body have the same genes. The difference between our different cells in our body and our different tissues in our body is that certain genes are turned off in some cells, and other genes are turned on and off, differentially in different cells. So your nails, or for example, your skin cells have certain genes that are turned on and certain genes that are turned off. They're different from, let's say, your bone cells or your hair follicle cells. So it's that differential expression of these 25,000 different genes that determines different tissue structures. So the basis of pillar one is genetic and molecular testing. Genetic testing refers to the mutations that are specifically in the tumor cells that have caused the normal cells to turn into tumor cells. We're only interested in the tumor cells. It's called tumor DNA sequencing. There's many different tumor DNA sequencing tests around. And molecular testing, right now we're using expression. In other words, how many genes are turned on or overexpressed or overactivated in the tumors compared to other cells. So you could go to the next slide. So pillar one, genetic testing. So genes can be altered in 3 different ways to cause cancer. You can get what we call fusion genes, where 2 genes are spliced together. And so a fusion gene basically is a mechanism where one component of the gene gets spliced onto another component of another gene. And typically what happens is in cancer is you will get a gene that's supposed to be turned off, like a gene that's only active in embryonic activity, and then gets turned off for the rest of your life, gets fused to a gene that's turned on 24/7. So in other words, you'll have this gene that's involved in digesting a certain protein in your body, and it's needed to stay on all the time. And what will happen is you'll get this event where the control region of that gene that tells it to stay turned on all the time gets spliced onto a gene that's supposed to be turned off, that's involved in growth and development. And you get this fusion gene where a gene that's normally turned off is now turned on all the time. And this is called a fusion gene. Okay, so the next one is a mutation. And so in this case, the mutation causes a change in the structure of the gene. So when it binds onto its receptor or its partner, in order to activate a signaling pathway, these signaling pathways are usually involved in growing and development and copying of cell structures and so on, a cancerous process. What happens is it gets stuck to it like glue. So it's like stepping on the gas pedal of a car to go up a hill and then having the linkage in your gas pedal break off while it's on full blast and having your car stay on full blast going up the hill. So that's what mutations do typically, is when they occur in oncogenes, that is. So when they occur in cancer-causing genes, they will cause that gene to stay stuck, turned on. When they occur in tumor suppressor genes, and tumor suppressor genes are a class of genes that prevent tumors from growing, basically what they do is they inactivate those tumor suppressor genes so they can't function anymore. So depending on the gene's function, the outcome will be either the gene's turned off completely or turned on all the time. So overexpression, this is something that basically refers to how much of the gene is produced. So every gene will have a certain amount that it's required in the cell. And obviously, like anything else, too much is not a good thing. So it's like, having 2 glasses of wine is a great thing. Having 2 bottles of wine is, it might feel good in the moment, but you can have a lot of side effects from that. So it's very much the same as with genes. You need a little bit at the right amount, or the right amount at the right time, and then that gene gets turned off. Overexpression occurs in genes that are typically involved with growth and development, and the cancer cells basically turn the genes on and they stay turned on. When we refer to overexpression, we're referring to overexpression without a mechanism. In other words, the fusion gene also causes, constitutive signaling, as we call it. Mutations also cause constitutive signaling, and overexpression can cause constitutive signaling. So all 3 of these are mechanisms that cause a signaling pathway to stay turned on all the time. Overexpression is just typically what we call an epigenetic. In cancer, it's an epigenetic mechanism. And it basically is the switch. It's like the light switch gets turned on and it gets stuck turned on. Typically, there's a process of acetylation and methylation in epigenetics that gets fairly complicated. But it's what we call a control region or promoter region of the gene. When it has what we call methyl tags on it, it's turned off. And when those methyl tags are removed, then the gene gets turned on and activated. So typically in epigenetic changes, what happens is something happens to the control region that turns on the gene when it's not supposed to be turned on, and it's turned on too high. So that's overexpression. So that's one of the other mechanisms, apart from fusion genes and mutations, that can happen to genes that cause them to become oncogenic. Okay, next slide. So why am I talking about this? Why is it important to us? Well, understanding the mechanism that is causing your cancer is the essential component to determine what drugs to treat you with, how to treat a cancer, because drugs are designed based on mechanisms. They target a specific type of mechanism. Most drugs will target what we call, or most cancer drugs will target in a variety of different ways. So for example, a chemotherapy drug, typically what that does is it stops cells from it stops the cell cycle. So when a cell is copying itself, it interferes with that process and stops the cells from copying themselves. And typically what happens with chemotherapy drugs is they inject the drug into you, or you take it orally. The drug is active for a few hours, and in that time period, it interferes and prevents every cell in your body from growing and copying itself, regardless of whether it's a cancer cell or a normal cell. And that's why chemotherapy typically has so many side effects, is it kills a lot of normal cells too. So with precision oncology, we like to bypass chemotherapy and go with targeted therapy, which uses drugs that target the specific altered genes through the mechanism they're altered. And so we're going to basically talk about how to detect that. So the 3 main types of tests we look at is tumor DNA testing. And tumor DNA testing, for the most part, we're interested in which genes are overactivated. In other words, what particular genes have mutations that cause them to stay turned on. So typically we look at about 500 or 600 different genes right now. and we look for mutations in those genes that we know cause them to stay turned on. The next one would be RNA expression testing, and this is relatively new. Can you go back?
Yeah, I was just going to go to the slide where I'm actually
Sure.
talking about that in detail since.
Yeah, well, we'll go over that in a second. Can we just go back?
Okay.
Thank you. So the next one is RNA expression testing. And in short, basically, this is the amount of the product of the gene. Sorry, I'm not finished yet.
I'm sorry, I'm not trying to here.
Yes.
Hang on, it's taking me in the wrong direction.
Okay. Okay, so once again, tumor DNA testing looks for mutations in the genes of the tumor that cause the genes to stay stuck on. RNA expression testing looks for how much of that gene is produced, and inherited mutation testing. So inherited mutations can increase the susceptibility to certain carcinogens. And basically inherited mutation testing focuses on tumor suppressor genes, whereas tumor DNA testing focuses for the most part on oncogenes, in other words, cancer-causing genes, and inherited mutation testing focuses for the most part on tumor suppressor genes, in other words, genes that are shut off, that are supposed to be turned on, that protect you against cancers. Okay, we can get into a little more detail now. So ding. So tumor DNA sequencing, basically tumor DNA testing allows us to look at the new mutations in your DNA and tells us what has caused the cancer for the most part. Once we know that, if we know, for example, you have a BRAF V600E mutation, then we can target it with a drug that targets that particular mutation. So it's very important because it allows us to use a drug that targets only the cells in your body that have that mutation, which would be your tumor cells. Okay, next slide. Okay, so RNA expression testing. So basically, this is relatively new. A lot of doctors are not aware that this is now available for patients. We started using it about almost a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, and it's just been an incredible tool for us. It's opened up so many different treatment options for our patients, especially with rare types of cancers like sarcomas and so on. But we like to do it with every cancer we get. So basically what it is it counts the amount of the RNA molecules and then compares it to normal cells. So let's say we look at, so we'll look at 20,000 different genes. Let's say one of those genes is a gene called KRAS. KRAS is normally only supposed to be turned on. It's only supposed to have, an average of 25 transcripts per cell in a normal healthy cell. And in your tumor, it has 300 transcripts. Then we know that it's highly active and it's overactivated, and therefore we can find a drug that inhibits that particular overexpression of that. And so they're drugs that will target overexpression versus a specific mutation. Another point that Michelle put here that I think is really great is in tumor DNA sequencing, you can have a lot of different mutations that we know nothing about. We do look for key mutations, but there's a lot of mutations that we refer to as variables of unknown significance. In other words, they're mutations that happen in cancer-causing genes, but they're unique to you. We've never seen them before, so we don't know how they affect that gene. We don't know if it turns it off or turns it on. So we can't really go forward with a targeted therapy. So the vast majority of what you get from a tumor DNA sequencing has been VUSs, variables of unknown significance. And because of that, many doctors have said, well, we don't see a lot of value in tumor DNA sequencing because, we get a lot of these unknown genes. Well, the beauty of this point, and thank you for mentioning it here, Michelle, I think it's really imperative that it's put in here. One of the most important things about RNA expression testing is it can tell us whether those VUSs are overexpressed or not. And so therefore, it doesn't matter if that mutation is causative or not. If that gene is overexpressed, then we can target it. And that's the important thing. So it can tell us whether a VUS is relevant or not. And so that opens up and adds important information to a lot of the genetic tumor DNA sequencing that was typically thrown away or not included in tests. So we can now use that information to a high degree of accuracy. And so, once more, it tells us, which one of those genes are in the highest concentrations and how to target them. So you can go to the next slide. So inherited testing, the most common, poster child mutations for this are referred to as the BRCA1 and 2. And so these are classic tumor suppressor genes. And so certain mutations can occur in these genes. They're tumor suppressors. If they see that there's a lot of DNA damage in the cell, they will stop that cell and they will cause apoptosis and prevent that cell from growing and producing more, daughter cells. So they're very important. We've got quite a few different tumor suppressor genes. BRCA1 and 2 are just, two of them. But the important thing about inherited testing is it tells us whether these pathways are deficient and whether you have an increased sensitivity to certain carcinogens. So if you have a BRCA1 and 2 mutation and it's inherited, passed on from your parents, that does not mean you're going to get cancer. It means you have a higher risk of getting cancer if you're exposed to carcinogens. So it's very important to get this. If you have one of these tests and you find out you have this BRCA1 or 2 mutation, then you can change your lifestyle. You can eat, a healthier diet. You can avoid smoking. You can have, a few extra drinks less at the party than you normally would if you didn't know you had these mutations. You could live your life differently and then probably have the same risk factor of cancer as somebody who didn't have these mutations. So they allow us to consciously make daily decisions. This knowledge allows us to make these consciously daily decisions that can have a great impact on how we develop different diseases, including cancers. So typically, if we see a cancer in a person that is under 50 years old, this is called the Amsterdam criteria, or part of the Amsterdam criteria. If we see a patient that is under 50 years old with a cancer, then we assume that they have a mutation in a tumor suppressor like BRCA1 or 2 that increases their risk. So we like to do inherited testing too. But more importantly, it allows us to say, well, sure, you missed this. You don't, you have cancer now because you have this mutation, but you have kids. So let's test your kids. And if they have the mutation, then we can take the steps like monitoring them, getting, extra scans, maybe getting an MRI every few years when they're young adults, and, watching instead of just ignoring it. We can watch and catch the cancer at a very early stage. And we can also teach them about the benefits of living a healthy lifestyle with their mutations. So knowledge is power, and inherited mutational testing is the power there. So can we go to the next slide? Oh, I think we lost Michelle. Oh, here she is. She's back. You're mutated, or you're muted.
How dare you? There was a cat screaming in the background. I was trying to keep it quiet for the folks at home.
It was a Freudian slip, wasn't it?
Yes.
So precision oncology. So what do you do with this information? Well, there's a lot of clinical trials. So if you have if you know what your molecular features are of your cancer and your doctor says, well, we don't have anything to treat that, you can just go onto clinicaltrials.gov and you can Google clinicaltrials.gov, type in the type of cancer, type in the type of mutations you have, and it will give you a list of all of the clinical trials all around the world. And then you could potentially get in a clinical trial. So
if I can just interject there, Alex, 2 points. One, I've shared this information about clinical trials because I really want you folks to know that you're not stuck. There are so many options and so many new ones coming out all the time. And I think that's critically important if you have cancer, is, staying open to these new possibilities that, FDA again and Health Canada approve things, not just experimental. You're not a guinea pig. And there's a clinical trial service. It's called Heal Mary, HEAL, healmary.org is the website. And Alex just suggested that you go to a government site, which is excellent in the sense that everything you find there is going to be evidence-based and you can have confidence in it. But it's not the easiest to navigate. Heal Mary has taken that information and put it into a much easier package. And they actually give, the website is set up so that you can enter in your personal data and the system will actually select the trials that could be of benefit to you. So I'm going to up the ante on the clinicaltrials.gov, and I'm going to suggest, if this is of interest to you, even just again, just to help infuse you with more hope and to know what's coming down the pike, to go there, healmary.org. But in order to utilize a lot of these treatments, you do have to have had this genetic or molecular testing and know what mutations you're wanting to target in a lot of these cases.
Yes, that's an excellent point, Michelle. Heal Mary does use clinicaltrials.gov. That's their main resource that they search through. But what they do is they search through it for you. They take your information and search through for you. So I was actually going to introduce them after I talked about the database. Clinicaltrials.gov is the international database, but a company like Heal Mary is great because they will look through these trials and find out what's best for you for free. So next slide. So precision oncology simplified. Here's where we're going to cover everything. So I think I think there's an excellent point here. Before you do any molecular testing, you have to have a biopsy. You don't always have to have a biopsy. There's a lot. Tumor DNA sequencing can be done through blood, and there's benefits and disadvantages to both approaches. We like to start with a biopsy sample because it gives us the most amount of DNA. And then we like to use a liquid-based approach if the disease comes back many years later, because it detects emerging mutations that may only occur in certain tumors. So one of the problems, especially in Canada right now, is most of the biopsy samples are basically treated kind of as a way for pathologists to look at the cells through a microscope, maybe apply some stains, but they're not really treated with the knowledge that they can be used to extract the DNA and the RNA. And so there's many things that can be done with a biopsy sample or a tumor tissue sample that could protect it and can protect the DNA and the RNA. And that's not always done. They say if you're going to get a biopsy, don't get it on a Friday because it's liable to stick around in the lab over the weekend and not get, put into its proper protective covering, which is referred to as FFPE for the most part. So a lot of the time, the biopsy samples are compromised and they're not as beneficial for RNA and DNA sequencing as we would like them to be. So I think Michelle's brought a great thing here in that 40%, there's new data to show that at least 40% of biopsy samples in Canada and the States, you can't do tumor DNA sequencing on them. It's too degraded. They weren't treated properly. They weren't, the fixation time wasn't adhered to. There's all sorts of pathology guidelines for biopsy samples that are not always followed. So next slide. So one of the problems is some of the large, what we call Illumina-based sequencing panels. There's companies, many companies that are doing tumor DNA sequencing tests right now. I believe Michelle quoted once that there's about 7,000 companies doing tumor DNA sequencing. Some of the larger companies, one of them is Foundation Medicine, another one is Caris. Great tests. They produce these wonderful tests, but they use what's called a hybrid capture technique in obtaining the DNA. And while that produces great data and it's very accurate at accessing very low, what we call low resolution mutations, in other words, mutations or DNA that occurs at a very low frequency, the problem is 40% of them fail at least. And, it's very frustrating because a lot of times when we order a test through Foundation Medicine or Caris, a lot of times, we'll wait all this time and then they'll come back and say, oh, sorry, the sample failed, we've got nothing. So that's changed. There's a new tumor DNA sequencing protocol now, which is PCR based, and it actually is optimized for these poor samples. So it's a great tool. In fact, we just invested in a lab that does tumor DNA sequencing that uses this technology. It's an incredible technology. It uses robotics. So you just pop the sample into the machine, robot does everything for you. And then, 2-3 days later, you get this mass amount of data. And it's really good because it allows you to use these poor quality biopsy samples that are so common in Canada and the States right now. So, once again, hopefully we'll catch up with our preparation of biopsy handling. I really appreciate the fact that Michelle put this in because it's an important thing. And so if you do have problems with your biopsy sample, give us a call. We'll help sort that out. Next slide. So precision oncology simplified. What do we need to look at? We need to look at your medical history, your medical records. We need to look at your mutations in your DNA. We need to look at how those mutations interact with each other. And this is very important because a lot of the emphasis is, yes, you have a BRAF V600 mutation. Yes, this drug will work with you. But what's missing is, will other mutations in that same gene or other genes prevent that drug from working for you? And so that's something that not a lot of people are doing right now. We spend a lot of time on that, looking at not only is this the right drug for you, but is there anything in your genetics which will prevent that drug from working for you? So in other words, this drug is designed for your mutation. However, do you have another mutation, a co-mutation? And we call these desensitizing mutations. In other words, you may have a BRAF V600E mutation, and your doctor may say, oh, let's get you on, dabrafenib or encorafenib or something like that, or vemurafenib. Well, we may look in there and say, well, you actually have a secondary mutation in your BRAF gene that prevents that specific BRAF inhibitor from working, and therefore you need this BRAF inhibitor made by this company. So this is something that's very important that not a lot of attention is put on, but how do your specific individual mutations interact with each other, and do they require that you use a certain company's drug versus another company's drug? And then, of course, which needs to be targeted. Which treatments or combinations of treatments are best for you. And typically it's going to be combinations of treatments. What dosage of those treatments is best for you. And of course, are they FDA approved or Health Canada approved? We typically only deal with FDA and Health Canada approved drugs. FDA approved drugs is typically what we work with. And then also, are there any clinical trial? Is that clinical trial available for you? So there's a lot of information in looking at personalized research that we need to look at. So next slide. So targeted treatments. I think we covered a lot of these points here. They've been designed to target specific mutations in you, and they can be given through pill form or intravenous. A lot of times these drugs are what we call tyrosine kinase inhibitors, and they interfere with what's called the AT-rich domain of a tyrosine kinase domain, which is basically the activation area of the gene that turns it on and off. So typically these drugs have less side effects than standard care, and obviously they can lead to longer survivals in most cases. So once again, targeted therapies, they seek out your mutated cells and only target them. So off-label drugs, basically an off-label drug is a drug that was designed for BRAF mutations in melanoma. It's been used, the clinical trial showed it's beneficial in melanoma, but now we have a colon cancer patient with a BRAF mutation. Is that drug going to work in them too? Well, often that's the case. However, you have to do it a little differently. So for example, if you were to use a BRAF inhibitor in a patient that had a BRAF mutation in a colon cancer, it's a different type of cell. So in other words, you have to combine it with another pathway inhibitor. And that's typically going to be a MEK inhibitor as well. and an EGFR inhibitor, because unlike the melanoma cells, colon cells have an active EGFR for the most part, epidermal growth factor receptor. And so you have to add a third drug with that BRAF inhibitor. So basically off-label is saying, using a drug that targets a specific mutation that was first identified in one type of cancer, and now we're finding it in another cancer. And so this is a pretty important thing. One of the biggest problems in oncology right now is most oncologists are specialists. They'll do one type of cancer, or gynecological cancers or breast cancers. So therefore, they won't really know what's going on in other types of cancers, and that's a huge problem, because there could be the perfect drug in a prostate cancer patient. They could have, a breast cancer doctor could have a patient with high androgen receptor overexpression, and therefore a prostate cancer drug would be really good for them. But if they didn't know about androgen receptors in breast cancers, they're not going to know that that particular drug is going to be beneficial for them. So it's really important to have a specialist that deals with all types of cancers. And typically they're referred to as community oncologists. But someone who does not focus on one type of cancer, they're going to have, if they only focus on one type of cancer, they're going to have limitations. They're not going to know how drugs from other types of cancers could benefit you. And that's a constantly changing field. So off-label drug knowledge is really important. Next slide. So we're going to talk about a few advances now in melanoma. So obviously we've mentioned, 5-6 years ago, we would have talked about how these new drugs, BRAF inhibitors and immune therapy, and how wonderful they are. Now they're standard care. And so we're going to talk about what's next, what's coming down the pipeline. And so this is something that's been around for a long time. In fact, this is something that inspired me to get into cancer research many, many years ago. I read a book on this by a famous doctor that was working on this, and he was using pig organs for adoptive cell therapy, and he just wasn't getting anywhere. It's still something that is very precarious, but we're starting to see information on it. We're starting to get FDA approvals on certain types of adoptive cell therapy. So, what is adoptive cell therapy? Well, basically, as I mentioned, the tumor cells will attract, tumors will attract immune cells. And then once they come in, they'll use something like the PD-1 pathway or the CTLA-4 pathway, or one of the other, 12 pathways to shut down the immune cells and then steal their resources. So we know that there's going to be a bunch of immune cells that fight tumors inside the tumor. And so what adoptive cell therapy does is it takes a sample of your tumor, it finds those immune cells in the tumor, they cut those immune cells out, and they're called CD8 positive lymphocytes. So there's two types of lymphocytes we typically see in tumors. There's what we call the Tregs, they're called regulatory cells, and then there's the TILs, tumor infiltrating lymphocytes. The tumor infiltrating lymphocytes are the important ones to us. They get turned off by the tumor. The Tregs are the ones that actually get hijacked by the tumors. They're CD8 or CD4 positive, and the CD8 positive lymphocytes are the TILs. We're interested in reactivating the TILs and getting rid of the CD4 positive cells, because the tumors basically just use them. They don't use the CD8 positive cells, they just shut them off. So in adoptive cell therapy, what happens is they take out the CD8 positive lymphocytes, the TILs, tumor infiltrating lymphocytes, they put them in a petri dish, and they grow them up to a massive amount. So, they may only have a couple million that they isolate from the tumor, or maybe even, a couple thousand. And then what they do is they grow them up in the super medium petri dish that's designed to feed the TILs. And then they'll get about 27 billion, they'll get a lot more than that, but they'll try to inject 27 billion back into you. And then they'll add something called high dose interleukin, which helps these T cells. And then what they'll do is they'll also shut down the other lymphocytes in your body. And so that requires some, what they like to do is a myelosuppressive chemotherapy, which basically they use for stem cell transplants. wipes out your entire immune system. And then there's non-myelosuppressive, which basically just kills a certain arm of your immune system, doesn't kill the myeloid cells. And so basically they're killing the lymphocytes in your body and they're replacing them with the ones that were found in the tumor, because they're assuming the ones that are found in the tumor are the only ones that are important to you. The other ones aren't as important. And they do that with basically using 2 days of a drug called cyclophosphamide, which is a really old drug, and then 5 days of another drug called fludarabine. So next slide. Okay, so recent trial with this adoptive cell therapy. It's called lifiluso. And most adoptive therapies are like CAR T cells. That's another adoptive T cell therapy. They seem to have luso on the end of their names. So lifiluso is this one. And so in a recent trial, they used this process, and they called these TILs that they amplified and injected in your body, they called them lifiluso. And they injected them into patients who had been on these PD-1 inhibitors and had progressed on the PD-1 inhibitors. And so in other words, they didn't have a lot of treatment options left for these patients. They'd done the immunotherapy, didn't work, or it worked for a while and it stopped working. So in these patients, they had a response rate of 36.4%, which is really good for an advanced stage disease, especially like a melanoma. So in other words, 36.4 patients out of 100 responded to this drug. And the median duration of responses, which means what was the average time period that these patients responded for, and it was 33 months. So at least 50% of those patients just, still had a response to this treatment at 33 months, which is really good for a late stage melanoma patient. So more importantly, more than 80% of the patients had a reduction in the tumor burden, with another 18% experiencing further tumor reduction after the trial had finished. So they seem to find the greatest benefits were in patients who only had a short duration of PD-1 therapy. So next slide. So some other scientists decided to take this one step further. They said, okay, well, let's do this in patients that had never had immune therapy, PD-1 inhibitor. Pembrolizumab is a PD-1 inhibitor. And let's combine this with pembrolizumab, a PD-1 inhibitor, in patients that have never had this therapy. And so they did this, and they got an incredible disease control rate of 100%, which is great, and an overall response rate of 85.7%. Now, these were patients that have never had immune therapy, so you'd expect a better response, but still, this is really good. And so it says all responding patients remained in remission at cutoff of the trial. So the trial hasn't been going on that long, but as of now, it's looking really good. So combining lifiluso adoptive cell therapy with pembrolizumab seems to be the way to go. So next slide. Okay, so as I mentioned, there's probably 12 to 14 different ways that that cancer cells shut off the immune system, different pathways. As I mentioned previously, there's the PD-1 pathway and there's a CTLA-4 pathway, and we have drugs for both of those. Ipilimumab is the classic one for the CTLA-4 pathway, and then there's many different PD-1 inhibitors: pembrolizumab, atezolizumab, nivolumab. There's lots of different ones now from different companies for PD-1. So LAG-3 is the third offering of this pathway that we've been working on. And so LAG-3 is it's part of this, it's what we call the immune checkpoint pathway. So when LAG-3 is active, it inhibits the T cells in the tumor from killing the tumor. So a new drug's designed, relatlimab, and basically what it does is it shuts down this LAG-3 gene, and it allows these tumor cells, or it allows these CD8 positive TILs, tumor infiltrating lymphocytes within the tumor, to be reinvigorated and to attack the cancer again. And so one study, they looked at combining PD-1 inhibitor with LAG-3. This LAG-3 inhibitor, the PD-1 inhibitor was nivolumab. And so they found that combining this LAG-3 delayed disease progression significantly. Now, these were advanced patients that were, pretty late stage. And so it definitely helped to prevent the disease from coming back, prolong disease progression, much more than just using the PD-1 inhibitor alone. And so, the rates are pretty good. The progression-free survival, which is the amount of time where 50% of the patients in the trial had their disease recur. So with the nivolumab alone, it was 4.6 months. But when they combined it with this LAG-3 targeting drug, that went up to 10.1 months. So that's pretty good for that. More importantly, the 12-month progression-free survival means at 12 months, how many patients were still disease-free was 48% for patients receiving the dual therapy, and 36% for just the nivolumab monotherapy alone. So you can go to the next slide. And so this is another drug, which is a different approach, which I really like. It's called a how would I describe it? Basically, it's referred to as a conjugate drug, bispecific, also known as BITE, B-I-T-E. Bispecific means that it has two functions. And so in this particular trial, or this drug, there's a lot of these drugs being developed now. And they're usually what it is it's like an antibody that targets a certain protein on a cell attached to a chemotherapy drug. Or in theranostics, it's an antibody that attaches to a certain thing, such as a PSMA, that attach and that brings in a particle of radiation. So it's like targeted chemo or targeted radiation therapy. However, in this particular case, they did something very interesting. They realized that a lot of the melanoma cells have this protein on the outside of them called GP100. And they thought, let's create something that binds onto the GP100 and then also binds onto an immune cell, like a CD8 positive TIL cell that we know is going to kill the tumor. So in other words, let's find a way of attaching the tumor cell to the T cell. So, what a great idea. And so what they did was they actually recreated something called the T cell receptor. They took this T cell receptor, which is something that the T cells use to bind onto a tumor cell, and they put it on one end of the drug, and then they put an antibody or a small molecule that binds onto this GP100 onto the other end of the drug. So it's kind of like a hinge with the T cell receptor here on this side that it will grab hold of a T cell, will grab hold of the T cell, and then this here will grab a hold of the tumor cell and brings them both together. And so this is a very interesting approach. And so in this particular trial, they used this drug that they had created called tebentafusp. I don't know where they come up with these names. It's just crazy names. This drug significantly improved overall survival versus one of the different therapies such as pembrolizumab or ipilimumab or even dacarbazine. Now, this trial was done in treating a certain type of melanoma called uveal. And uveal typically is a melanoma of the eye. And it's a very difficult disease to treat because it spreads very quickly. And by the time you get your diagnosis, it can spread to different organs. But more importantly, you don't see the BRAF mutations, and these eye-based melanomas don't respond to immune therapy. So there's not a lot of treatments for patients with uveal melanoma. So it's a really horrible form of melanoma. So to have a new treatment for it, I think is really important. And to have this drug, on these patients. So typically this pembrolizumab and ipilimumab or dacarbazine, which is a chemotherapy drug, they were used on these patients, not very effectively. These drugs don't typically work on uveals. And so to have this new drug work was really great. So one of the downsides of this is that this drug only works in a subtype of people that have what we call a human leukocyte antigen. It's a specific type of antigen on the cell surfaces. And this antigen is referred to as HLA-A asterisk 02.01. However, 50% of Caucasians, and that's half of the people that are at high risk for melanoma, have this particular HLA antigen. So if you want to get tested and for this antigen to see if this drug will be beneficial for you, or if you want to go in a clinical trial for this drug, then you'd have to get tested for this antigen and see if you have that. So important development, and it's going to be good for a lot of people. So next slide. So another trial, pembrolizumab, which is a PD-1 inhibitor. So as I mentioned previously, this is uveal melanoma again, because that's the hard one to treat. So normally pembrolizumab doesn't work that well in uveal melanoma. However, they found that when they combined it with entinostat. Now, if I recall, entinostat is an epigenetic drug. I don't know a lot about it. Haven't spent a lot of time with it, but I believe it's a acetylase drug. I believe it increases acetylase or acetylase is a process that happens to DNA. And I know what this drug does. It basically reactivates a bunch of genes that have been silenced by epigenetic mechanisms in cancers. And these are genes that will attack the cancers or help attack the cancers. So it's it releases the brakes on a bunch of different drugs. So in this trial, the PEMDAX trial, they had 29 patients with metastatic uveal melanoma, and they combined these two drugs together. And the objective response rate was 14%, which is pretty good for metastatic uveal melanoma. But the clinical benefit rate was 28%. In other words, clinical benefit rate refers to what we call the RECIST criteria. It's you have 4 different responses in the RECIST criteria. And the RECIST criteria is you either have a complete response where all of the tumors respond, or you have a partial response where some of the tumors respond and some of them don't, which is still a good response. Or you have what's called stable disease, where none of the tumors shrink, but none of them grow, which is also good. And then the last response in the RECIST criteria is what we call a negative response, called progressive disease. And that's where the drug doesn't do anything. So what clinical benefit rate is it's basically a statistic that combines the 3 positive responses from the RECIST criteria. So in other words, it combines complete response, partial response, and stable disease together. And so those 3 statistics together were 28%. The overall survival in this, and remember, these are very late stage patients, was 13.4 months. That's the average overall survival. So it may not seem that much, but if you're looking at being told to go into palliative care, both of these drugs are readily available. You can get both of these drugs in Canada. If you have uveal melanoma and your doctor's saying, it's metastatic, there's nothing else we can do, say, hey, I know of a trial. And I know a combination now. If you give me pembrolizumab and entinostat, then I will get at least, I'll have a 50% chance of having at least another, 13, 14 months. So there we go. So Michelle, did you want to follow up with the takeaways?
Sure. As always, I just really want people to hear that there are right now enhanced options. These things that Alex was mentioning just now don't actually require genetic testing in order for you to get. So those are options kind of without that piece. Obviously, we're all about the most accurate diagnosis, the most thorough diagnosis for you, so you can get the most benefit out of medical science and what it can do for you. But I just wanted to say there are options even without that. but with the genetic and molecular testing, we get even more options. And to keep in mind all 100,000 clinical trials for cancer out there. Certainly there are some for melanoma, and there's just new stuff coming all the time. So even if that last statistic said, okay, you might get a year with this particular treatment. Well, in the next 3 to 4 months, something even better for you can certainly be now available and FDA approved. So there's always reason to stay on top of the science and what is coming, and not to just accept the basic standard care that you're being offered as the best that there is.
Yeah. And, can you go back to that last slide? I think you really covered on something that I probably didn't emphasize that I should have. So thank you for that, Michelle. Yes, we've covered things here that don't typically require genetic testing. The benefit of genetic testing and RNA testing is it can tell us whether a multitude of other targeted therapies like ULK inhibitors, NTRK1 inhibitors, ROS1 inhibitors, EGFR inhibitors. There's a multitude of different drugs available that are being used in different cancers that may benefit you. And we won't know unless we do tumor DNA testing and RNA expression testing. And so here we've just covered some basics that apply to everyone without any testing. But if you get genetic testing, it's going to open up this massive amount of treatment options that are only going to be good for you.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
Okay.
So we're picking up, we didn't take a detour, but it took us a while to get here. We talked earlier about those, the 4 pillars: the genetic and molecular testing, the personalized research, the targeted therapies. We've just run through a few of those options. And now pillar 4, which is how do we keep an eye on this and make sure that your treatment is working as well as it should, that you don't stay on a treatment when your cancer is gone. Is sometimes in standard care, if the protocol is 12 doses of something, but you may have responded adequately within 6, you don't need all that extra treatment, and I'm sure would prefer not to have it. So the more accurately you monitor how your treatment is working, the more successful your treatment can be.
Mm-hmm. Great point.
So liquid biopsies, Alex, what do you want people to hear about that?
So once we know your mutations that are causing your cancer, then what we can do is we can use them to monitor you. So the standard monitoring to see if you're responding to a treatment is CT scan. Are your tumors growing or are they shrinking? Oh, you don't need to wait around for that, and you don't want to wait around for that. If you're fairly late stage, you don't want to wait 4 months and say, oh, your tumors didn't respond to the drug. Sorry, nothing else for you. Now you got tumors all over your body. You want to know in real time. And so another tool that we use that is really beneficial to tell you whether your treatment is working or not, whether your tumors are coming back or not, is once we know what genetic markers you have, then we can use those and we can track those within your blood. So we can take a blood sample. Let's say you have a KRAS mutation, and we know it's only in your tumor cells. So we can actually test the level of your blood for that mutation. We can say, well, it's at 8% before you start this new drug. And then 2 weeks later, after you've been on the drug, we can test you again. And if that percentage has gone down from 8%, let's say it's 2% now, then we know the treatment's working. Or if it hasn't gone down, then we know the treatment's not working. We need to do something else. There's a multitude of different ways we can look at that. So obviously, one of the most important things is knowing whether that treatment is working. And this is one of the ways we can determine whether treatment is working is through a exosome-based liquid biopsy. Mm. So another important thing, and I'm glad you brought this point up, is when you have immune therapy, a certain amount of patients go through something called pseudoprogression. It's about 30%. It can vary. Pseudoprogression can happen right away. It can happen anytime within your treatment when you're on immune therapy. But basically what it is since the immune cells, or the CD8 positive cells, are being reactivated, they start growing and copying themselves within the tumor and basically entering the tumor and killing the tumor from the inside out. That also causes the tumors to look much bigger. And so, typically when immune therapy is given, previously in the olden days, when we first started using PD-1 inhibitors, doctors would see these patients where the tumors were getting bigger. And then more importantly, it would look like they're having new tumors, because most imaging can only detect a tumor that's, a few millimeters in size. If the tumor is smaller than that, then it doesn't see it. So when people went on immune therapy and had pseudoprogression, those little tiny tumors that were only a few millimeters would now all of a sudden become, 5 or 6 millimeters or maybe a centimeter. And it would look like they're growing out of nowhere. And so the doctors would look at a scan and say, oh, you've been on this immunotherapy, but this tumor is bigger. And now you've got a bunch of new tumors over here in your liver. It's not working. In reality, it would mean that the treatment's actually working, because those tumors would be necrotic. Now, normally, what you would do to see if a tumor is necrotic or not, which means it's dead, is you'd use the PET CT. So you'd say, okay, there's no biological activity. This is a dead tumor. However, that doesn't work while you're on immune therapy, because your immune system is drinking up those sugars. So remember I said the immune cells use the same sort of resources as cancer cells. Well, if you look at if you have a patient that's on pseudoprogression, and they get a PET CT, their tumors are going to have high SUVs, because the immune cells, not the tumor cells, but the immune cells are going to be drinking up all that sugary fluid. Immune cells love sugar. And so they're going to be drinking up that sugary radioactive isotope. And so it's going to look like your tumors have high SUV, they're highly active, and they're getting bigger, when the reality is the immune system is just killing the tumors. So how do you get around that? Well, it's a real problem. And we still have problems to this day, having doctors saying it's not working, we're taking the patient off the immune therapy. And so what we do is we use this liquid biopsy, because the liquid biopsy tells us how much DNA of that tumor, and tumor specific DNA, is in the blood. So we've had many cases where the patient was under pseudoprogression. The doctors thought that they were progressing, took them off the immunotherapy. We did a liquid biopsy, found out there was hardly any of their tumor DNA in their blood, and said, hey, this patient needs to be back on immune therapy. And so we got them back on immune therapy, and they ended up, getting a proper response. And then after a while, obviously the doctors realized that, oh yeah, it was immune therapy, or it was a pseudoprogression. We've also found the opposite, where the doctors thought, well, this could be pseudoprogression. Let's keep the patient on for another few months. And then we did a liquid biopsy. We found no, their KRAS mutations at 27%. There's no way this is pseudoprogression. It's gone up. So let's try a different approach. This immune therapy is not working for that patient. So very important. Liquid biopsy is a very important tool for precision oncology.
Agreed.
Yeah. So takeaways. Did you want to do this, Michelle?
Well, I certainly can. I think anybody who attended could do this, because we've heard it all. This was there was a lot of kind of heavy science in your discussion today, Alex. I just want to acknowledge that for anyone listening at home. You were on a roll today, talking about the kind of the minute details, which I think is excellent for us all to be aware of. So this is a very simplified overview. And again, you have your PDFs with a little bit more detail for you, and some links to explore. But fundamentally, cancer is a disease of mutations. And what I want to add about that is that sometimes folks will call us and they'll say, oh, well, my doctor said I don't have any markers for cancer, or I don't have any mutations for my cancer. So, therefore only chemo and radiation can work for me. That is not physically possible. Cancer is a disease of mutation. So if your doctor is saying you don't have any markers or anything like that, and therefore, chemo and radiation are your options, all that really means is that the tests that they were able to offer you didn't turn up anything. It isn't possible for you to have cancer without having some mutations. And there are tens of thousands of mutations that can be tested for, including using that overexpression test that Alex was talking about earlier for the RNA. So that's important for you to know, that there's lots of information that can be gleaned, and it really looking at those mutations and what is driving your cancer is really the most critical element, because without that information, you cannot get on these targeted therapies. You don't know, your oncologist couldn't possibly prescribe them for you. They wouldn't even know where to begin. And targeted therapies, again, it's important to just understand the difference between the chemotherapy and the targeted therapy. The chemotherapy is killing all rapidly reproducing cells in that moment, and targeted therapies are attending to the specific mutation that they're designed for, either by helping your system to function better, or by repairing or just shutting down that mutation. So they work so much better. They are the evolution of cancer care, and it's really important for you to know which ones are going to be right for you. And for the liquid biopsies Alex was just talking about, and he mentioned earlier, the combination of PET CTs plus liquid biopsies is kind of the ideal way of monitoring how well your treatment is working. So I just wanted to mention that because it's not in the slide, but that's a good point. And again, just a simple blood test. When we provide this tool for people, we send a nurse to your home. They take a couple of vials of blood, and within a week or so, we have a result for you about how well, with a 99% accuracy rate, your treatment is working, as opposed to you having to wait 3 to 6 months to see on a CT scan, and then up to 60% accurate at best. I want you folks to know how to reach me, and then we're just going to go into question and answer period now. If you have any questions from today, now, or 6 months from now, you can reach me at mmorand@ctome.com. If you'd like to speak to Alex about your case, or have him review your medical history, or make specific recommendations for you following our chat today, you can certainly reach out to me and I can coordinate that for you. Or you can find all the information about that at our website at ctoam.com, and ctome.com/consultation is where you will find us. Or is that a /? Yes. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, as all this information again is in your PDFs, and I want to be able to see you all better as we go to questions. So there were a few folks who sent in some questions, Alex, and then, hang on, let me close that down and open up the right one. And then we have Jack, who has posted in the chat some of his questions. So why don't we start with that, as Jack is present with us.
Yes.
Can you see in the chat, Alex, or would you like me to read it to you?
Oh, can you read it to me?
Sure.
Yes.
Okay, so Jack, good evening from the UK, and thank you for all this information. I was diagnosed with, let's see here, he's saying MM.
Multiple myeloma?
I'm going to assume that's the case, in July 2020, so a year and a half ago or so. He was not able to have SLNB due to COVID. Clear margins when he had his tumor removed.
Okay.
I'm guessing, is a bit worried that some lymph nodes might have had the melanoma, but weren't identified. He had a CT scan in December 2020, so about 6 months after diagnosis. Was advised to have ultrasounds every 3 months.
Why don't we hear from Jack?
I don't
I have a
know.
few questions here.
Jack, are you interested in speaking with Alex directly here? If so, I can invite you to unmute yourself. Yeah. No. So maybe you can just read in the chat yourself, Alex, to get.
Yeah, I'm not sure what MM is.
Oh.
Is it melanoma?
Well, this is a presentation on such things.
Yes. So Jack, can you confirm that we're talking about melanoma? Oh, metastatic. Gotcha.
Good guess, Kim. Well, that's Kim's guess, and I
Okay.
suspect she's right about that.
Okay.
But yeah, it sounds like Jack has gone AWOL here, so you're not going to get a straight response from him, it would seem.
Yeah.
So he's wondering if he had lymph nodes that were affected by cancer, would they have shown up in an ultrasound? Is there anything else he should be doing?
Yeah, I would get a PET CT. I wouldn't waste time with an ultrasound.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Definitely get a PET CT.
So base starting advice is get that PET CT so you can see. Anything else that he should be doing to help prevent the spread?
Yeah, I would definitely, I would go through all of what we covered today, but start with, definitely start with the PET CT, find out where things are at, and then, do some tumor DNA sequencing. That's one of the first things I would do.
Right. And then that helps you find out all those options.
Exactly.
Yeah, because what's he been given so far? Yeah, not a lot so far. Yeah.
I wouldn't rely on ultrasound for diagnostics.
Yeah. In fact, I think there's well, anyway, yes, ultrasound, not the most reliable tool, or we didn't even mention it on our list for that very reason, really, right? It's not even yeah. We also have a question from Klaus. Hello, Klaus. Thanks for joining us in Denmark. Any chance of safe biopsy? He says he had aggressive spread both times, so he's reluctant to have another biopsy, specifically in his liver, as he's afraid of cancer spreading. So what can you recommend there?
I'm interested to understand, exactly what he means by spread. I think the chance of spreading from a biopsy is very low. It can happen, but typically when you get a biopsy of the liver, they have a sheath that they pass the punch biopsy tool through, and they run that sheath directly to the tumor. And then what they do is they do the punch of the tumor. And so basically the tumor is not contacting anything. And so there's little chance of it spreading. The other thing too is only stem cells can actually metastasize. And stem cells are, 1 in every 6 million cells. So even a punch biopsy is highly unlikely to spread. I mean, it does occur in very rare cases, but it's not that common. If you really are concerned about it, then what I would suggest is get a liquid Foundation 1, or get a liquid DNA sequencing test, and that way, you're concerned. Obviously, you want to know what the molecular features are of your cancer. Then get a liquid-based test, a blood-based sequencing test. Yeah,
we can help you with that, Klaus. Klaus is saying he said he had aggressive metastasis in his armpit.
Yeah.
What other reason would there be? If you're saying probably not, that's probably not caused by the biopsy, what other reason would there be perhaps for him to be told that he had some, a big growth or a massive spread of cancer shortly after biopsy?
Well, typically by the time you find a tumor that's 0.5 centimeter, that means you got tumor cells all over your body.
Okay. So the metastasis was probably already there, just not detected.
Probably already there. Whether they're going to set up shop or not and grow, it's hard to say. But typically, cancer is going to be everywhere. Okay. A lot of times it doesn't grow. Not all. Very, realistically, a small percentage of tumor cells can actually, or cancer cells can actually metastasize and grow. It's very small. It's just that there's so many of them.
Yeah. So Klaus, I guess the answer is if you would, and understandably, prefer not to have a biopsy of your liver specifically, then there are blood-based tests that you can use. They don't give quite as much information, is that right? Or they don't look at quite as many genes?
I guess the big question is, if he also had mets in his armpit, what is the point of biopsying the liver? I don't quite understand the need for that. I mean, if you're doing genetic testing, you can just pick a tumor anywhere in the body and it's representative of the rest of the tumors. The individual biopsy testing to see if something's a tumor, you can just use a PET CT. You don't need to do a biopsy of a liver lump to see if it's a tumor or not. Just do a PET CT. So I'm not sure. I guess I would really be wondering what the purpose of the biopsy is in the first place.
Oh, good. He says he had a PET CT. I think you're striking on something that when this whole genetic testing thing for cancer started, we'll say 12-ish years ago or so, there was this idea that there could be a lot of difference from one tumor to the next or one location to the next, but that really hasn't been shown to be true, is it? No. Yeah. So that might be, so perhaps that's the information, the outdated information. Yes. Okay, Jack says, yes. Oh, too bad, Jack. I'm sorry to hear that. It was malignant melanoma.
Okay.
Did not have sentinel lymph node biopsy.
Okay.
Had a CT scan and having regular ultrasounds. But he's saying, from what you recommend, PET CT is best. Yes. And they do have those in the UK. They definitely have more of them and use them more readily than in Canada by far, for sure. Yeah. Anything you want to add for Jack then now with this new data?
Hard to say. Definitely get a PET CT and see where things are at. Yeah.
Okay, so if the question, Jack, was what more can I be doing to kind of keep an eye on where things are at, that would be the thing. And then, as Alex mentioned, of course, some of the genetic testing or the molecular testing, whether the tumor DNA or RNA, or both.
Yes, both. Definitely, I'd get both.
Yeah. Kim is asking, can someone who has never been diagnosed with melanoma benefit from a liquid biopsy?
Yes, for sure. Yeah.
Can you say more about what would the benefit be?
Yeah, so the benefit would be is if you don't know if you have cancer, and then you do a liquid biopsy, a discovery-based liquid biopsy, you can, so you can sometimes identify mutations that are specific to certain types of cancers. And you can say, well, even though you don't have a diagnosis and there's nothing we can see, you have some KRAS mutations, which are indicative of a tumor. So definitely there's information from a liquid biopsy, yes.
And we kind of use them in that way for early detection of recurrence, right? Exactly. Just so that before a solid tumor has formed, you can find out that, okay, the cancer is coming back. You can get a few treatments as opposed to perhaps a course of 8 or 10, and have a nice kind of back into remission for a period of time.
Right, correct, yes.
Yeah. Okay, a couple more questions here. Please feel free to go ahead and load up the chat with any other questions. I'm going to mention, let's see here. I think that you kind of answered this one, but this was specifically the question sent by Claire. Are there any treatment options apart from immunotherapy for melanoma when you are BRAF negative? And what can be done if these stop working?
Yeah, I think we covered a lot of that within this this seminar here. But definitely, if you want to expand your options, you're going to get tumor DNA sequencing and RNA expression testing, and that will open up a lot of different treatment options. Yeah,
I guess we keep saying that, but that's the most important thing to take away, right? Is there literally right now there are hundreds of targeted therapies. And again, remember those 100,000 clinical trials, more treatments and combinations of treatments being identified all the time. So there very likely are numerous options for you right now, actually independent of all those trials, but you have to know and of what's going on in the inner workings of your cells so that you can be matched to the proper treatment.
Totally, it's everything. It's everything.
So Mary sent me a little bit of background here. She was diagnosed with July 2020 with melanoma, a thickness of 2.9. And we did talk earlier about how the thicker the tumor, the generally historically worse the prognosis, right, Alex? That's the information.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
The information that we shared earlier that I posted here is that the thickness matters when it comes to melanoma. So she's saying a thickness of 2.9 millimeters, I think. Oh, question, did not have a brain scan. Would that be beneficial?
Yeah, definitely. MRI of the brain, I think, is something you should look at with melanoma.
Okay, MRI.
Yeah, MRI of the brain.
Okay. Apparently there's a trial in the US where stage 2 patients are receiving targeted therapy to help with a recurrence or help prevent recurrence. Oh, and then she was just asking if we know of any other trials or our thoughts. I think we took care of that. We ticked that box. Would you recommend RGCC testing?
The Greek test.
That's the Greek.
No, I don't recommend it. No. No.
Would you
There's some great companies around. We've seen some pretty crazy results from the Greek tests, unfortunately.
It's not consistent.
It's not consistent. I'm not sure they really do proper sequencing. I've just, we've resequenced some of their results and they just haven't been good. I would stick with a reputable company that, is in North America.
Okay, but what if you're in Europe?
Or Europe. All the companies that are in North America also are in Europe too. Terrace Foundation One, all of these companies have offices all throughout the world.
Okay. So no was the answer to whether Alex would recommend that type of test. Again, there are 7,000. So that's a 7,000 different types of genetic tests right now. Not all of them are specific to cancer, but that's a lot. And so if you looked up genetic testing for cancer or tumor DNA sequencing, you would be inundated with options and everybody kind of using similar language. So today we've given you kind of specifics of what you want to make sure your test looks at. And again, we've talked about how many hundreds of mutations can be tested for. So you want to make sure you're looking for a lot and that those key variables are being attended to.
I noticed Kimberly added another question there. She said the standard treatment for melanoma is WLE and sentinel node removal with skin checks every 3 months. If the nodes are clear, there is no internal exams offered. I think that's pretty old school. I don't know a lot of doctors that would rely on that, but I'm sure there are still some out there. Do you think, PET CT is important here? Most definitely. Every cancer.
But what do you, so if Kim, who is sorry, go ahead.
I just wouldn't, I wouldn't conceive that what is described there is going to be beneficial to too many patients. I think it's a recipe for disaster.
Right, but what she's saying is and that's a kind of a good example of standard approach, which is kind of a watch and wait, right? Okay, so we've done this, we've removed those questionable lymph nodes, remove the masses to the best of our ability, and now we're just going to keep an eye on things.
Well, it's standard care because that's what is affordable. It's not standard care because that's what's best. Sure.
Yes, and again, as we were saying earlier, standard care varies from country to country. Canada is 23rd out of 28 if you are Canadian, 23rd out of 28 for cancer diagnostics. It's not great for folks with
you could also have the argument that since the College of Physicians and Surgeons argued for PET CT
in 2005.
2005, that is standard of care. It just is not applied.
Yes, you could use that argument. I guess we're using the term standard care as in, if I'm a Canadian cancer patient, what's going to be offered to me most likely. And so that's kind of what we laid out. But yes, in other countries, PET CT is more standard of care. And yes, it should be used. if your oncologist doesn't think PET CT is of value or that it won't change the way they're treating you, then I think we would both agree it's time to get a new oncologist. And that's actually not as hard as it might
It's quite
seem.
easy.
Yeah, you really just have to actually ask.
Yes.
And certainly we have been working in Canada for over 11 years now, and we've made some great connections in most provinces with folks who are kind of up to speed that we could refer you to if that's the case. So don't settle, I guess, is the main message.
Don't settle for a non-PET CT doctor, that's for sure.
No, or even again, or if one says, oh, you didn't have any markers for cancer and they're not prepared to support you to get further genetic testing, that's time to move on to a new doctor as well, because it kind of implies their knowledge of evolved cancer care is somewhat lacking. Exactly. And this is your life. This is your life. You only get one. You do not want to, you don't want to put your faith in somebody who doesn't have current information. There are a lot of really good oncologists out there, and many oncologists are very frustrated by the limitations of the systems in which they work, and they're happy to have you collect evidence-based data. That's the key. The information you bring them needs to have some basis. There has to be some good evidence, some good either clinical trial data or peer-reviewed research to support what it is you're asking them to do for you. But many oncologists in Canada are willing to go outside their standard care menu when that evidence is presented. In fact, we found in most countries, actually, in the work that we do, over 90% of the time, oncologists are willing to prescribe innovations to care or advancements in care based on this genetic and molecular data that we present them. But you have to get the data first. And that's oftentimes right now, sadly, in cancer care, it's up to the patient to take that step. And that's really why we started this service in the first place, because it's overwhelming just to figure out what tests to get, and then how to interpret that data accurately, and how to find the right treatments, and then how to get your doctor to go ahead with it. And so that's really the role that we play, is either doing that for you or helping you take those steps.
Exactly.
Does anybody have any other questions? Anything you were hoping we talk about that we didn't get around to? Because there is always so much, and I try to keep the slides to a minimum, and you know, we don't want you spending your entire day here with us. Please let me know. I'm keeping an eye on the chat if there's anything else. I'll give you a moment to enter that. Alex, maybe you could say something back to, you were talking about the MRI. Why is it that you recommended an MRI for the brain and not a PET CT?
The MRI is just, it's the tool for looking for brain tumors.
But why specifically?
It's better with soft tissue.
Ah, okay. So somehow it gives a clearer image, or yeah,
exactly. Yes.
All right.
Plus, you know, with CT scan, you're getting a radiation dose. You know, it's not something you want to do on a regular basis with your brain.
I see. Right. So a standard PET CT doesn't look at the brain as well. It's kind of neck down.
Actually, we have a situation where I would love the patient to get a PET CT. They had they just found out that they had a brain tumor, and the doctors want to treat it with radiation, but they don't know if it's live or dead. The patient's on a drug that does target brain tumors, and so, you know, chances are that the tumor is probably dead. But now the doctors have noticed it. They're not following up with it. They're just saying, oh, we did an MRI. There's this tumor there. You know, we should just blast it with radiation just in case. But you know, they don't know if it's a dead necrotic tumor or not. A PET CT of the brain alone, a dedicated brain PET CT would help solve that issue.
So again, it's very patient specific.
It is highly.
Yeah.
Yes.
So even what you just said, okay, MRI as a rule for soft tissue, but there are some circumstances where PET CT is more advantageous.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what precision oncology is all about. It's very personalized. We have a little saying here, myself and my administrative team, every case is unique, and it is just in every way, not just the mutations that you will have versus someone else, even watching this presentation, but just in terms of the steps that need to be taken, when and how, and all of those things. So it really is a very personalized approach to cancer care. But what's exciting and why we're here talking to you today is because there are so many different things that you can do right now to really change how long you live and the quality of your life. One more question here before we wrap up, Alex.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes, the answer is definitely yes.
May I ask the question for those who won't be able to see the chat, please? AC is asking, is liquid biopsy and PET-CT the most accurate way to check if any type of cancer spreads? Any type of cancer, and they're referencing uterine cancer here as an example, but go ahead, Alex.
Of course, a standard biopsy, obtaining that tissue and getting it in your hand is the best way, but a liquid biopsy and a PET-CT is a close second.
Yeah, and back to Canada, I know some of you watching are in other countries. There's a great reluctance to do surgery here, not just because of COVID, although it's worse now with COVID, but you know, there's kind of a, if we can't absolutely guarantee that we need to, or that it's really going to be beneficial, there's a great reluctance, and so that can be a barrier. So the blood-based testing and the PET-CT are non-invasive ways to find out what's going on for sure.
Yeah, they are, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. All right, any other questions, folks, before we wrap up for today? I'll just remind you, we're going to be sending you a link to watch this in replay with chapters, so you can skip ahead to the parts that are of most relevance to you. And you'll also get a copy of that PDF in your email, so that you'll be able to review all of this information at your leisure. You're welcome to share this with anybody, with your doctor, with family members, advocates, other cancer patients, other any sort of support groups that you belong to. Anything we say is we're happy to have you share publicly, and invite more questions as they come up for you, as I'm sure they will. Anything you want to say in closing, Alex?
No, not that you haven't covered already. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. I know every moment of your life is very precious, and giving us 2 hours of your time means a lot. We don't take that lightly. So we hope you feel you've really benefited from the time that we've had. You're welcome, Kim. Thank you for coming, and we're happy to be here helping you. All right, take care, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Let us know how we can help. You're welcome.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.